Welcome into another episode of the Big Blue News Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Beesmore, and today I'm joined by a very well-known person in the Kentucky community. Please welcome John Clay of the Herald Leader. How are you doing?
I'm good, Chris. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well. About to preview the Ole Miss game with you, so I brought you on, of course, to talk about that. What have you seen so far that you've liked about UK through the first four games of the year?
Well, I've been very impressed with the defense. I know the coaches weren't real happy with the way the defense played last week against Northern Illinois, but up until that point, I think they played really well. Obviously, the shutout of Youngstown State, even though Youngstown State's an FCS team, first shutout since 2009, first home shutout since 96. And then before that, the way they played at Florida, I thought they pretty much won the game for them at Florida. A couple of big turnovers, Jordan Wright's interception, and Keydron Smith with the pick six. The offense has kind of struggled to get out of the gate under with some offensive line troubles and under new offensive coordinator Rich Scangarello. But I think the defense has carried them through these first four games, and I think that's the primary reason they're 4-0 at this point.
For sure. I mean, you're not wrong. The defense has definitely been carrying UK. I remember against, I believe, Northern Illinois. I was at that game, and I just remember the second play. Will Levis, I thought he threw an interception. Everybody thought in the crowd he threw an interception, but luckily it was ruled, an incomplete pass. So definitely for sure, our offense has been struggling a little bit.
Yeah, but I think some of that's to be expected. I mean, if you look at the offensive line, they lost basically D like Cox transition there. You're lose player lost really quality players in draft picks. Luke Fortner and Brugdahl could have been an NFL draft pick. So you had new guys in those positions. And also, like I mentioned, Rich Scangarello, new offense. It's basically a continuation of what Liam Cohen did last year. Didn't have Chris Rodriguez for the first four games. That obviously hurt, and that's a big boost that they get him back Saturday against Ole Miss.
Mm-hmm. What do you think UK will have to do to get a win against Ole Miss?
Well, a couple of things. Number one is they've got to slow down that Ole Miss running game. Ole Miss is fourth in the country in running the football. Lane Kiffin, he's done a really good job of developing his or kind of twisting his offense, tweaking his offense. That's the word I'm working for the running attack, because he's got some really good running backs. His quarterback, Jackson Dart, who is a transfer from USC, he's turned out to be a good runner. He had 116 yards last week against Tulsa. Kentucky's got to slow down their running attack. Of course, Ole Miss is a little different twist too, and there's a very high tempo offense, a lot like Tennessee. The other thing Kentucky's got to do is they got to be able to run the ball and keep the Ole Miss offense off the field. And I think that's where Rodriguez comes in. I think that obviously getting him back, he's going to be a little rusty. He hasn't played in 4 games, but he has been practicing. It's not like he's been suspended and wasn't able to practice with the team. So I don't expect him to have too much rust. But that, I think, also will open up the things for Rich Scangarello to do with his offense, how play action and so forth. So to me, the running game is going to be the key on both sides of the ball. Kentucky's got to contain Ole Miss's run game, and they got to be more effective. They've had 2 games where they had 103 yards rushing. They're going to have more than that, I think, on Saturday to get the win.
I definitely agree with that, and also having Chris Rodriguez finally back, for the 5th game of the year, I'm excited to have him back. How do you think our running backs can limit their turnovers going into the Ole Miss game?
Well, that was a problem for Chris last year, as everybody remembers. He had some problems on fumbles, holding on to the football. When he held on to the football, he was really good. He had his last 5 games last year, he rushed for over 100 yards. He's preseason All SEC, I think, because of that. But that'll be a factor as well. And on the other side of the ball, Kentucky's got to start creating some turnovers. Like I mentioned in the Florida game, those 2 interceptions were really big. They didn't make any turnovers last week against Northern Illinois. It would be good for him to get a turnover or 2 on Saturday. So that obviously would be a big point. Same thing with Will Levis. As you mentioned, he almost had an interception, but he ended up, not having an interception, played a clean game. Obviously, they could use that against Ole Miss as well on Saturday. Turnovers are always big, especially in SEC games, especially when you go on the road. So that'll be important Saturday.
Yeah. I know Kentucky will more than likely be missing another key defensive player in JJ Weaver. How big of a loss do you think that will be going into Saturday's game?
Well, it's a tough loss, obviously. I mean, JJ's, if he's not their best defensive player, he's certainly one of their best defensive players. One of the reasons they won the Florida game is because of the way JJ Weaver and Jordan Wright played in that game. They contained Anthony Richardson, Florida's big quarterback, from running the ball, who had such a big game the week before against Utah. And like I mentioned, Dart had 116 yards rushing for Ole Miss against Tulsa. But I think Alex Safari has played really well, especially for a freshman, playing that kind of nickel back defensive end, outside linebacker spot. He's been a guy that they've raved about since the first day of camp, and I think he's filled in there well. He was Brad White today at practice was asked about Afari. He said, he does make mistakes, but he bounces back from those mistakes. He's an impact player for him, so that has helped. And having Jordan Wright back, missed the first game from a suspension as well, but obviously having him back has helped. But you'd like to have JJ Weaver, especially in SEC road game.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the true freshmen, they've been playing great both on the offensive side, wide receivers, and then also on the defensive side with Keaton Wade, like you said, also Alex Safari. But how important do you think it'll be with having two defensive players on UK that actually played at Ole Miss, with Jacquez and Jones and then Keydron Smith?
I think that can't do anything but help, because they know, like I mentioned, Ole Miss's offensive scheme is a little different this year. They're much more run heavy than they were in Lane Kiffin's first 2 years. But still, Keydron and Jacquez, especially Keydron, because he played at Ole Miss last year, where Jacquez transferred to Kentucky last year. He knows the personnel. Ole Miss does have some new players, but he knows most of the personnel. He knows most of those players. They know how Lane Kiffin thinks, because they went up against him in practice every day. So, I think that should help. Obviously, Ole Miss knows about Keydron Smith and Jacquez Jones as well. It was funny when we were talking to those two guys today. Keydron admitted he'd never been in the visiting locker room at Vaught Hemingway Stadium there in Oxford. He said he didn't even know how to get there, how to get to the visiting locker room. But I'm sure somebody will show him the way. But obviously, I think having those two guys does nothing but help you.
For sure, I agree. And it's definitely interesting that, Jacquez didn't even know how to get to the 15 locker room. But like you said, he'll find a way on Saturday to get there. Now let's talk a little bit about Ole Miss. They run a 3-2-6 defense, which means, for people who don't know, it's Ole Miss usually will rush 3 down linemen and drop the rest of the coverage. Then 5 players will play in under coverage, and the 3 remaining players will play deep. How do you think that will affect UK's offense?
Well, yeah, Mark Stoops mentioned that on Monday, that they have an unorthodox defense in their alignment. Rich Gangarello, we asked him about that on Monday. He said that, that's, on Tuesday, it is a little unorthodox, but coming from the NFL, there's so many packages that you see in the NFL, nickel, dime packages, because they throw the ball so much in the NFL. He didn't really think that would be too much of a change. He felt like the offense, that the way it's designed, that it can deal with that. But it is different with that many defensive backs. Actually, I think you're going to see more and more teams go to that. Kentucky actually kind of goes to that. And like we were talking about with Alex Safari, he plays that kind of nickel back, but also outside linebacker edge rush, where he can cover. He could also blitz if they want him to blitz. He can do a variety of things. With more spread offenses and with more teams throwing the ball in college football, I think you're going to see more type of those kinds of defenses where they play a lot of. Kentucky plays nickels and dime packages too. It's just not their base defense like Ole Miss. It's their base defense.
And do you think other colleges will soon follow having that type of defensive formation?
Yeah, like I said, I think that's a good chance of that. If you see, especially the way you see more teams throwing the ball and more spread offenses, they need guys who can run and tackle and cover and do a variety of things. And that's usually your defensive back and your secondary players. Like I said, I think that's one of the things that Alex Safari is made for, the way they're using him in that position, because he can do so many different things. And that's a lot of what colleges are looking for defensive players right now.
And I remember last year the Bengals dropped 8 against the Chiefs, and that's one of the reasons why they were able to, come back and win and eventually go to the Super Bowl, which was a great day for me. Let's talk a little bit more about Ole Miss's defense. They gave up last year 519 yards per game, now they're giving up nearly 345 yards per game. That's still a lot. What do you have to say, about the decrease, but still giving up plenty of yards on the defensive side?
Yeah, they look better defensively, but they haven't really played anybody up to this point. I mean, they played Troy in the opener. Nothing against John Summerall, the former UK player and coach who's coaching at Troy. He's actually doing a really good job there. But they're not quite on Ole Miss's level. Then they played Central Arkansas, an FCS team. They played Georgia Tech at Georgia Tech, but Georgia Tech's really bad this year.
Yeah.
They just fired their coach, Jeff Collins. Ole Miss beat them handily. And then last week they played Tulsa. And Tulsa was probably the best offensive team they played up to this point, and they gave up a lot of yards to Tulsa. Gave up 27 points. So I think the jury's still out. They look improved defensively. They've had a change, had some staff changes defensively, but I think we don't really know until they get them into the meat of the SEC schedule started with Kentucky. So we'll see how that works out. I do know the Kentucky coaches have been very complimentary of Ole Miss's safeties. They feel like that they have two really good safeties. And I think they feel like that's the strength of the Ole Miss defense.
Now let's talk about the offensive side. You mentioned earlier that Ole Miss had two running backs rushing over 100 yards along with the QB. How will UK, stop the run this coming up?
Well, I mean, obviously they got to win up front. They got to win a physical battle with. I think the defensive line is going to be a key. I think Kentucky's young defensive line, those guys who were so heralded a couple of years ago as recruits, I think they played pretty well up to this point. Everybody's raved about the way Deion Walker, the true freshman, has played. That'll be big. To me, a big key in stopping the run, though, will be the guys behind the defensive line. When you're talking about experienced players like a Jacquez Jones, DeAndre Square, Jordan Wright, those guys, I think those guys are going to be key to get penetration and make tackles. You really got to contain them. They got a really good freshman back there, Judkins. I watched the Tulsa game. He's a combination runner. He can run with power, and he's also pretty shifty. He's a guy they're going to really have to try to contain. But I think obviously it's going to be, as most games, it's going to be one in the trenches. Kentucky's defensive line has to do a good job of keeping the blockers from getting to the second level, and then the linebackers have got to be able to to plug the holes and make the tackles. I think that's going to be big in this game.
And I remember in the Florida game, I thought Anthony Richardson was gone. It looked like he had a wide open gap to run through to get a touchdown. I think it was Jacquez and Jones who made that tackle, caused the fourth down, which, that's what UK will have to do, even if it's not fourth down. It's 3 downs, they have to get stopped, whether it be passing or running. So hopefully UK can do that. Let's talk a little bit now about the QB for Ole Miss with Jackson Dart. How much of the factor do you think he'll have on this upcoming game?
Well, he'll definitely be a factor. He's a transfer from Southern Cal. He started out the season. Actually, Luke Altmaier, their other quarterback, started the first game of the year, and Dart came in later. Then Dart has started after that, but it wasn't really until after the Tulsa game that Lane Kiffin announced that Dart would be their quarterback going forward. He'd been kind of alternating those two guys, although Dart played pretty much the whole game against Tulsa. He was a highly recruited player. Came to Ole Miss transferred to Ole Miss to play for Kiffin. Today, Brad White talked about he's a really good athlete. I mean, he showed that last week, 116 yards rushing. Most of those were off of design runs, whether it's zone reads or taking the ball outside. So you got to be careful and watch him. But he can also throw the ball. You get the ball down the field. They got two big receivers in Mingo and Heath. Heath is a transfer from Mississippi State. They've got a pretty good tight end that they haven't really used a whole lot, but I'm sure they're going to try and incorporate him more into the attack. So Dart is definitely, he's definitely a good player, a developing player, and Kiffin has a history of, if you look back at Matt Corral, he has a history of developing quarterbacks. So, he's a dangerous guy on Saturday.
And Matt Corral was crazy last year. He played great for Ole Miss, and
right.
He left. What do you think will be the deciding factor for the game between UK and Ole Miss?
Well, I think it goes back to kind of what I said earlier. It's going to be the team that can run the ball and stop the run. So I think that's going to be the deciding factor. Kentucky's got to contain that Ole Miss running game. Like I said, they're number 4 in the nation in run in yards per game running the football. Kentucky's got to be able to contain that, and they've got to run the ball on their side. They got to be more effective running the ball, not be a team that just solely relies on Will Levis and throwing the football. I think that's going to be the key. The team that runs the ball the best on Saturday is probably going to be the team that ends up winning.
And hopefully no turnovers for Kentucky, whether that be fumbles or interceptions. Hopefully none of that happens. Now let's talk about, what do you think the score prediction will be for this coming up game on Saturday?
I'm not, when they played, when Kiffin and Stoops met a couple of years ago during the pandemic, the first time the two got together, it was a 42-41 game. It was funny that Jacquez Jones and Keydron Smith today were joking around. They were asked about what they remembered from that game, and they said Matt Ruffalo missing the kick. They said, "Have you given Ruffalo a hard time?" And they said, "Well, Matt says he owes Kiffin one after missing that kick when Kentucky lost that game." I don't think it's going to be quite that high scoring a game on Saturday. I'd look more for 24-21, 28-24, something like that. I think Kentucky's defense is good enough for it. I think they'll hold them under the 40 points, but we'll see. I mean, it might be a fireworks game, but I'm not expecting that. I'm expecting more of a grounded out game, 24-21, something like that.
Are you saying UK will win?
I think they've got a good chance to win. Coming into the season, I actually picked Kentucky to lose this game, but I think they've got a good chance to win. To me, it's hard to know exactly how good Ole Miss is at this point because of their schedule. I mean, Kentucky did play Florida, which I think, at Florida, at the Swamp. So we got kind of a gauge on what kind of team this Kentucky team is. I don't know that we've gotten at this yet with Ole Miss because we haven't seen who they played. So yeah, if you made me pick for the game, I would pick Kentucky by a field goal. But I think it's kind of a coin flip game. It could go either way. It's a huge game for both teams. It's Ole Miss's SEC opener. It's going to kind of set the tone for them for the conference play for the rest of the year. And if Kentucky could get the win and start off 2-0 in the league, that's would obviously be a huge boost for Mark Stoops' team.
Yeah, for sure. And I have the same prediction going into the season that UK would probably lose to Ole Miss. I've definitely changed my mind since before the season started, and now I'm predicting UK will actually win. I think it'll be a somewhat high scoring game. I feel like it'll be, I would say, 35-31 UK. So it's going to come down to the very end, but I think UK will win. They will start out the season 5-0, 2-0 in the SEC. So I'm excited about this game. Do you think the time for the game will have a factor for the fans showing up at all?
Well, I don't know. It's funny. Lane Kiffin has been on the Ole Miss fans about getting there late and exiting early. I think part of that has to do with the teams they played up to this point at home, Troy and Central Arkansas and Tulsa. I expect them to be there early. It's a sellout. I expect them to be there early and stay late for the Kentucky game. I don't know about the time or how much. Traditionally, Kentucky hasn't always played well in noon games. But I think at the time's about the same for both teams, although it will be 11 a.m. for Ole Miss because they're on Central Time. But I don't expect that to be a major factor in the game.
Yeah, I'll be watching it before my friend's wedding, so hopefully
really?
It'll be a good time for me. Do you have anything else you would like to add?
No, I mean, I'm looking forward to the game. Kentucky hasn't played at Ole Miss since 2010 when Joker Phillips was the coach. So I'm looking forward to going down to Ole Miss, going down to Oxford, seeing the Grove, where the great historic tailgating area there at Ole Miss. It's a fun place to see a game. So obviously, any SEC game is a big game. Obviously, an SEC road game is a big game. And then I think it's an interesting coaching matchup. I wrote about it earlier in the week. Stoops against Kiffin. Stoops with his defensive background, Kiffin being an offensive guy. They both come from, coaching families, football families, I think, and they've both done a really good job of building winning programs at places that haven't historically won in the SEC. So I think all the way around, it's a very interesting matchup. And you got two top 15 teams, Kentucky number 7, Ole Miss number 14. So how can you beat that?
I'll definitely have to read your article that you wrote about the offense and defense with the coaches. So I'll definitely take a look at that article after we're done talking. But I appreciate your time tonight. That's all the questions I had. Hopefully, like I said, UK wins on Saturday. But thank you again, John.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Chris.
You're welcome.